We rarely empathize with the needs of others. We may become aware of them on an intellectual level. And there's a great, vast difference between that and actually empathizing with the needs and hopes and fears of others. We rarely enrich our own life experience by really merging, really blending, really empathizing with the conditions of other people's minds. And due to that, due to our self-absorption and sort of self-cherishing and our inability to relate to the situation of others, we find ourselves able to entertain hostility, anger, pride, selfishness, all of those things that are really detrimental to us. And we're able to maintain certain habitual tendencies that we honestly cannot see about ourselves. For instance, if I were to say to you, are you basically a kind person? Well, almost everyone in the room would say yes. We're here, we're being spiritual, you know, that sort of thing. But if I ask you how much time you actually spent during the course of any given day actually doing for others in a real compassionate way, keeping the bodhicitta or the compassion alive within one's mind, how much are you actually aware of the needs and unfulfilled desires of others? And we would be shocked, really, if we actually clocked ourselves in and out of such a realization. We'd be shocked at how little time we actually spend doing that. And so I think it's sometimes really helpful to make a purposeful and directed effort, such as the assignment that I've given to the children, of actually clocking in when it is that you are aware of the needs and desires of other people, and when it is that you actively participate in trying to help with that in some way. And the help can take different forms. Sometimes the things that people want around you aren't really good for them to have. I mean, maybe you have a teenage son that wants nothing better than a very fast car, and you know that that's not quite right for him. So you don't always give a person what they want, but you can certainly empathize. You can certainly be there in a very kind and profound way as a force for connection, for communication in someone else's life. We actually spend very little time doing that. We spend most of our time thinking about ourselves and our own problems and our own ideas, so fixated on our own ideas, so fixated on our self-cherishing. I do actually recommend that each one of you do an exercise like the one that I've given the children. You can, of course, polish it up and make it look a heck of a lot more mature so that you can live with yourself. But really, that kind of exercise is extremely useful. Sometimes we don't realize that we're a little bit almost dyslexic about kindness. Or, what is the word? Maybe we perseverate about kindness. We have this idea that we've already done it, you know, that it's happening, and we don't realize that it's not being written down at all. It's just not going out into the world. So sometimes it really helps to journal, to really see what you've actually done during that day to bring kindness into the world. That would be extremely useful. For our talk today, we're going to continue on the theme of kindness, but we're going to take a slightly different direction. First of all, as Buddhists, I would like you to think about what your primary directive is. Now, I want to ask first those that are in robes. I won't actually ask you. I'm going to give you the answer, but I'm going to pretend I'm asking you, because I'm desperately afraid that you might not know. Means though you are wearing robes and everything, that frightens me. Your primary directive is to follow the Vinaya. Vinaya is a set of cause and effect oriented rules, basically, a format that those in robes should follow. And the Vinaya becomes the heart practice of your life. And you should, of course, receive teachings on the Vinaya, which you have. You gradually begin to understand the Vinaya. It is your responsibility to study the Vinaya. It is your responsibility to go after information about the Vinaya, because that's your code. The Vinaya has a great many items that we should practice and look at. And particularly, as robed persons, as monks and nuns, there are certain rules that seem very strict, but that you must follow. For instance, I don't know if the lay people are aware of this or not, one of the rules in the Vinaya is that at a certain level of ordination, monks and nuns should not touch members of the opposite sex. Yet, here in Kunzang Peyul Choling, one sees monks and nuns shaking hands, hugging, handing things to each other. Are we breaking the Vinaya here? Are we doing that? Why not?
Because from our heart we're not breaking it.
Right, right. We have a slightly different perspective. The Vinaya is not changed, not in any way. What has been will always be. These are the Buddha's words. But in Vajrayana we have a slightly different perspective. If we have the idea in our minds, according to the Vinaya, that we should not touch members of the opposite sex in order to keep our celibacy really pure, well, their celibacy, I'm a married woman, very pure, that we should keep it very pure, yet we find ourselves touching each other. How does that actually work out? If I, for instance, were a nun, let's say, and I were to see a man that was very hungry or in need of some sort of medical help, some sort of, perhaps he fell down and he needed help getting up, do you think I would hesitate for one moment to help that person or to give them some food? Or if I saw that a person needed the connection of a hug, needed the connection of some comfort, needed a greeting in order to feel acceptable and welcome, do you think I would hesitate for one moment to give that sort of sustenance? Even if the Vinaya says not. That's right. That's because the highest ordination that I feel as a Mahayana and Vajrayana practitioner is that of compassion. And in our tradition, compassion and love supersede everything. So the Vinaya is kept, but it's kept differently. The way that these monks and nuns should be keeping the Vinaya is that, for instance, as a nun, whenever one sees a man, you should think of hold pure view about the man. You should think of the man as the meditational deity. You should think of the man as what we call the yidam, or meditational deity. You should think that in that man's pure form, he is the very Buddha. And one should think like that. One should recognize the innate Buddha nature in each and every one. And one should think that each and every one holds that nature, and that that nature is actually present. And we accomplish our practice by thinking of each man as the meditational deity. And we think of each woman, those of you that are monks, well, only one of you here are. Those of you that are monks would think of the woman as being the goddess, or the enlightened female deity, or the Dakini, primordial wisdom Dakini. And in that way, upon touching a man or a woman, one is never actually touching a man or a woman. One is only approaching the meditational deity or the goddess. So that one still keeps one's inner commitments, and yet the highest commitment is that of compassion and pure view. Of course, you can't bend that irresponsibly. In fact, you can't bend it at all. None of you can take marital partners. None of you can engage in any kind of ordinary relationship in that way. But in order to uphold the highest ordination of compassion and the highest practice of pure view, you can engage in those kinds of activities that enhance that view. Now, for lay people, we don't have the same strict approach. As lay people, though, we should never, never think that we can do more than them. We should never think like that, because if we're thinking like that, quite frankly, that's a pretty schlocky practice. That's just not going to cut it. We should never think, oh, because I'm a lay person, My conduct can be very loose. I can do whatever I want. You still, as Buddhists, if you have actually moved into the posture of being a Buddhist practitioner, you have also, in common with these monks and nuns, the highest ordination, and that is the high ordination of the practice of bodhicitta, or compassion. If you were to hold in your mind the idea that everything you do comes from the perspective of caring, of love, of kindness for others, then you're still holding your vows. The trap that we fall into, though, as lay practitioners, is the idea that because we are lay practitioners, we can basically get away with murder. Actually, the Vajrayana point of view is very much geared and directed toward lay practitioners. Lay practitioners have a great distance that they can go, and a great breadth and depth of practice that they can practice. They don't have the strict guidance rules to the degree that the ordained people have. But in a sense, they have an even more important responsibility, because not having those strict rules, they must find a way to practice purely. And as lay practitioners, that's our job, to seek out and really try to get for ourselves a way to practice purely. We may not understand how, and we have to search it out. It isn't enough to remain passive in our practice, to think that, well, eventually I'll get the answer and it'll be clear to me, and in the meantime I'll just kind of scoot along. That would not be holding a proper view. That would not be holding our practice as a precious jewel. And that would not be doing a good job. As a lay practitioner, we also have the responsibility of seeking out what is the absolute best way that we can hold our most precious inner vow, that of bodhicitta, or compassion. And we should aggressively seek out ways to do that. In order to seek out ways to do that, we must first examine how it is that we are in the condition that we are in. The Buddha teaches us that the primary directive or motivating force and the reason for all of our suffering is self-cherishing, ego-cherishing. Sometimes it looks like some of us have a lot more ego-cherishing than others. Sometimes it looks as though some people are able to do a lot for others and to be real kind, and other people are only thinking about their own needs. But in the truest sense, that's just a very superficial appearance. In fact, we are all exactly the same, in that we are all in a samsaric condition, stuck on ego-cherishing, stuck on the belief in the inherent reality of self-nature, and therefore suffering due to desire and hope and fear, not able to actually witness or see or relax into our own primordial wisdom nature. Now, in traditional Buddhist doctrine, we are given certain methods that will be helpful in alleviating that condition. These methods are pretty cut and dry, pretty simple. For instance, if we begin to practice preliminary practice, or ngundro, in that we examine the thoughts that turn the mind. And in those thoughts are not only the four main thoughts, but there are also many different sort of auxiliary thoughts that are there. Some of the ideas that we are led to examine is, first of all, the idea that all sentient beings are equal. And we are led to examine that in this way. First of all, that we all contain within us the Buddha seed, our inherent Buddha nature, and the reality that at some point each one of us will attain to that nature and will become awake, even as the Buddha has become awake. That each of us will attain that reality. For some of us, it will be relatively soon, only 10,000 lifetimes from now. Piece of cake. For some of us, it will be a lot longer. Sometimes we have to think that for some people it almost seems Almost seems like it will never happen because you're talking about aeons of cyclic existence. But the Buddha teaches us that each one of us has that inherent reality, and therefore we are, in our nature, the Buddha. So in that sense, we're exactly the same. We're also the same in our sentient beingness, if you can coin a phrase with me for a little while. And in our sentient beingness, we have certain things in common. We do have the ego cherishing. We do have the self-absorption. We do have confusion. We do have an inability to abide spontaneously in the primordial wisdom nature. We do experience death and rebirth in some form. All sentient beings do, even if they are not in the human realm. We all experience these certain conditions. We all experience suffering. We all experience hope and fear in some way. So the Buddha teaches us to understand that we are all very much alike. And in that situation of alikeness, we can find a certain like companionship with one another, a certain understanding or empathy toward one another, so that we don't judge as severely. If we do understand that we are all revolving in cyclic existence, us too, and that we all have hatred, greed, and ignorance, then when we look at someone else with hatred, greed, and ignorance, we might think, oh, that's kind of like me. I can understand that. I can see where that happens. So we develop a kind of patience or tolerance or kindness, and it's the fundamental step that must be taken before true compassion arises. So that's one method. And another method that we are given is that we should think about the plight of sentient beings. We should think, for instance, we're told to meditate that in the animal realm, some animals are kept whipped and beaten as beasts of burden. I saw some of that when I went, for instance, to India. The bullocks that pull huge carts, literally 4 times their size. And these are huge animals. They have a great deal of muscle, and yet they were carrying so much that they could only barely move. And they were constantly whipped and actually painted up and decorated in this terribly hot climate under terrible conditions. Think about oysters that are harvested for their meat and their pearl, that they live only for that. Some of them were born in cultivated areas, cultivated oyster farms, just to be eaten for their meat and pearl. And we think about all the different animals that are completely victimized, like the animals of, think about the animals that are food for predators and are constantly being hunted and killed, live in fear. Their main instinct is this highly inflamed and developed fear instinct, simply in order to preserve their lives. So we develop a kinship with other forms of life by understanding what their suffering is. And then we look at the plight of human beings, how human beings are basically taught by their authority figures and parental figures, and by their culture, it is dictated to them what they should do. Here in America, for instance, we are told that material values are of the utmost importance, and we spend a great deal of time in school, and then we spend a great deal of time in different kinds of preparation in order to become materially successful. And if you don't become materially successful and comfortable in a certain way, you're not considered to be an adequate human being, quite frankly. There's a problem there, and you never quite feel good about yourself, and there's an innate dissatisfaction. And for those of us that do succeed and do well at our lives, towards the end of our lives, we have a great suffering, and that is that we realize that we've gone to school and we've practiced and we've worked and been workaholics and done what we thought was the right thing, supporting our families and caring for our families and just doing the very best that we can, and then we realize at the end of our lives we have nothing. Nothing. All that we worked so hard for, we cannot take with us. We look around us, and the people that we gave whatever we worked for to also have suffering. How come it didn't heal them? Why didn't the money and the cooking and the housework and everything that we gave them, why didn't it do them any good? They're still crying. We look around at our lives and we go, what was that? And we realize that the only thing we can take with us into the bardo or intermediate state that prepares us for our next life is the habit patterns of our mind. And the habit pattern of our mind under those conditions is only intense grasping and tension. And that's a great suffering that we human beings experience together. Now, if we really understood that and meditated on that, we wouldn't have some of the same ideas that we have now. For instance, sometimes we think that because we're following a spiritual path, we should be just a little self-righteous, don't you think? We look around at other people who are very materialistic, who are spending their whole lives doing things that we consider to be lower activities. And we look around at people that even society labels as being as lower. We look around at prostitutes. We look at people that rob banks, both of which are doing things that they're doing for similar reasons to what we're doing. The prostitute wants money. She wants to make a better life, she or he. The bank robber wants money. They want to make a better life. They're looking for power. Same reasons as we do, just the activity is different. But of course, we feel ever so much better for whatever reason. But if we really understood and really meditated on the fact that all of us are in exactly the same condition, there would be no room for judgment. And we would really realize the plight of humankind and, in a greater sense, the plight of all sentient beings. Now, according to the Buddhist teaching, that gives us the foundation or fundamental necessities by which we can give rise to the bodhicitta, or the great compassion. But that's only the foundation. And here's why. The problem with our trying very hard to awaken to compassion is our own habitual tendency. Our own habitual tendency is such that we only concentrate on our own plight. Really, sometimes we do empathize with others. We think, oh gosh, that must be awful. It's just, that's too bad. Gee, that would be awful for me. So, you know, it's almost like you take a rubber band and you stretch it out just far enough to see what the plight of the other person is, but then the habitual tendency comes back in and bingo! Rubber band lets go, and now we're thinking about ourselves again. And that is how it is, isn't it? That is how it is. That is really the only way that we understand others, because we can understand how we would feel about that. And we're sure glad that it's not happening to us. And it's kind of like that. The problem there is not that you're a good person or a bad person. Good or bad has nothing to do with this. And you should not do the next step, which is what everyone does, to evaluate themselves accordingly. Here's what you've got to get. We are all sentient beings, and we are all exactly in the same position. If you think of yourself as better or holier than someone else, believe me when I tell you you're going to suffer because of it. And the reason why is because if that's true, then someone else is going to be better or holier than you. That is the truth. So that is not a game that you should play. You should realize the absolute sameness of the condition of all sentient beings. It is not a question of good or bad. It is a question of habit. Period. End of sentence. Do you hear that? That is so important. Because in hearing that, you have a key that you didn't have before. If you think you're either good or bad, there's no way out of that. If you accept that idea, you're going to find reasons why you're good or bad. And believe me, if you're operating in the good or bad realm, you're going to come out bad. Because there's always going to be something better than you. So if you're playing that game, you're going to lose. There's no way to win there. And you'll find reasons for why you are bad. You'll find reasons in your childhood. You'll find reasons in your parents will give you reasons. Your uncles will give you reasons. People around you will give you reasons. And your badness will continue in your mind. So we have to work very hard to shift the emphasis from the idea of good or bad, better or worse, into the habit, into the position of developing habit patterns or habitual tendencies. We've got to develop habitual tendencies, to develop the examination of habitual tendencies. We've already got them, we just have to examine them. Our habit, since we have been revolving in cyclic existence for literally aeons, and all during that time, in some form or another, have conceived the idea of self-nature. Our habit, then, is to hold the idea of self-nature as being very, very solid and very, very real. Our habit, absolutely from the get-go, is to distinguish between self and other. Our habit is to react toward other with hope and fear. Our habit is to think in that relative sense and that comparative sense, and there's no compassion in any of that. And it's not going to happen. In order to truly develop compassion, we have to first get the idea and really take to heart the idea that the only thing blocking us from giving rise to the great bodhicitta or great compassionate activity is our habitual tendency. And so no matter what we feel, whether we have the stupid idea that we're good or bad, or whether, whatever our ideas are about life, if you have them, set them aside for a moment and address the singularly important fact that you simply don't have the habit of truly empathizing and having compassion for the condition of other sentient beings in any consistent and real sense. It's a question of habit, not a question of good or bad. Are you able to feel compassion? Well, see, many students will come to me and they'll say, well, I love the idea of compassion. I think it's wonderful. I hope you're good at it. I hope you continue to teach it to others, but I just don't really feel compassion for other people. And so therefore I don't think I can be a Mahayana Buddhist. And I cannot count on all of your fingers how many times that has happened to me that a person has said, I love it, but it won't work for me. I just don't have any compassion. You can't hide out in that any longer. That's not a valid excuse, because the fact of the matter is that we are all in the same condition. No one here truly has the habit of compassion. Well, we have a little. Every now and then a jigger of compassion gets mixed into the cocktail of life. But in truth, pretty cute, huh? But in truth, we have very little. If we had a great deal of compassion, our whole lives would be given over to benefiting others. There would never be another choice. There would never be another choice. Everything that we do would come out a benefit to others. It would be like magic. You wouldn't even have to think about it if you'd really given rise to the bodhicitta and broken the habit of self-absorption. There would never be another option. But that's not the case for sentient beings. We're all in the same condition. So what we have to do is stop waiting to feel compassion. Because you're always going to paint yourself into a corner with that one. You're never going to be satisfied with what you're feeling. Until enlightenment, we're never going to be satisfied with anything. So you can't hide out in that excuse. You simply have to develop a new habit. And sometimes, when you're developing that new habit, it can look like this. Okay. Doesn't so much matter what I want here. There are other people that want things in this room, and I'm going to give it up. And it can look like that at first. That doesn't mean that you're not doing a good job. And it doesn't mean that you're wrong. And it doesn't mean that you're bad. And it doesn't mean that you're a martyr either. It doesn't mean that you're making an extremely valiant effort and should be rewarded. It doesn't mean anything. It only means that you're developing a new habit, bit by bit. And that's basically what we have to do. We have to, day by day, in a gradual way, reinforce, develop, and make larger the habit of loving. It is so mechanical. You wouldn't believe how mechanical it is. Once you get more in the pile of loving, well, here it's like this, this is self-absorption. We're like listing severely to the right. It's like this. Little by little, it's kind of like getting heavier on the loving side. At some point, and who knows when that day will be, it's not for you to judge, not for you to know, not for you to even care about. At some point, the balance will go in this direction. And you'll really give rise to the bodhicitta. And there will be a time when the loving habit that you develop so outweighs anything else that there's a funny magical thing that happens. This becomes invisible. The self-absorption becomes invisible. You won't believe that in the beginning, especially when you first start trying the habit of true compassion, because it just seems as though the weight of self-absorption keeps pulling you back, and it just seems overwhelming. But you have to remember, it's kind of like a rubber band. It's kind of like a rubber band. It's so hard, and that agony of feeling yourself go back to that same posture is going to be very difficult at first, but never mind. Never mind. Keep putting more and more in the habit of loving kindness. You're going to break it eventually. It has to happen. It's kind of like the spiritual law of physics, if you can imagine such a thing. Eventually, one will outweigh the other. It's just like that. In fact, if you would spend a lot less time evaluating yourself and judging yourself, and a lot more time just putting pebbles in that pile, you'd feel a lot better. In fact, if you'd take your eyes off this pile entirely and move toward that pile, you'd feel better still. It's almost as though once you begin to gather some weight in the area of proper, virtuous, habitual tendency, by magic, this thing starts to disappear. You're not looking at it anymore. There's a funny thing about the human mind that we don't realize. Do you know how in your mind you think you're concentrating on a million things at once? Some of you can chew gum, watch TV, listen to the radio, and write in a book at the same time. I mean, I've seen people do this. It's amazing. I have a son. Oh, my God, you can't believe this son. It looks like he can watch TV, listen to the radio, talk, and really carry on a conversation, dance while he's talking, and if he knew how to fry an egg, he could probably do that at the same time. I mean, talk about a Mongolian juggler. Each of us feels like, we can do so many things at one time. But the fact that we don't realize about the human mind is that that's not true. It can only do one thing at a time. But what happens is we do these things in such rapid succession that if we think about 10 things at once, it feels like what's actually happening is that we're thinking about this switch to this, switch to this, switch to this very quickly, and our minds actually become inflamed and agitated with the switching from one picture to the other. That's why it becomes valuable and precious to meditate on bodhicitta and to practice bodhicitta, because while you are practicing bodhicitta, putting your mind in this pile, while you are doing that, no matter how simplistic it is, even if it's just opening the door for somebody, while you're doing that, you aren't doing the other thing. And the great thing about the human continuum is that if you're not continuing it, it doesn't continue. The funny thing about continuum is that it loses its definition, its essence, if it's not being continued. So we are taught to practice kindness and to begin where we can and to increase it moment by moment. Because while you're doing that, you can't be doing the other. But believe me, when you're not doing that, you are doing the other. You are doing the other. So the bodhicitta becomes now not a great mystical attribute that we all hope we're going to get. It becomes a remedy. It becomes a method. It becomes an antidote. And you should see compassion as an antidote. There is no excuse, none, for you not to start right now. And you can't get into what's kind of like the diet syndrome with bodhicitta. I don't know how many of you have actually been on a diet, but if you're on a diet, you're like this. You go through your, 1,000 calories a day, so you're making your little chart and you're eating your boiled egg or whatever it is, it's your celery and ice or whatever, whatever horrible thing they're making you eat. And then at one point during the day, you just can't stand it, and you go back to your old habit and you think, okay, I've eaten celery all day, now I'm going to eat a piece of chocolate cake. What happens in our minds is we think, now I'm off my diet, and it doesn't matter. Well, you can't have that kind of diet mentality with your bodhicitta. For instance, if you practice bodhicitta for a good period of time and suddenly you blow it, not only blow it big time. You know, I mean big time. You really blow it. Then you think, I'm not a compassionate person, I'm not good, I'm bad, it's gone for today, I'll try maybe next week sometime, I'm hopeless, I'm helpless, I've blown my bodhicitta diet. You begin to form all these exaggerated conclusions based on what has just happened. If you could approach yourself in a relaxed way, moment by moment, and you did practice bodhicitta for a certain period of time, and then you really, really blow it, there would be no inner tension that prevented you from simply going back to the bodhicitta. What you've done is expressed both of your habits, your new one, which is difficult, and your old one, which is easy, and you can fall into it any time you don't practice your new one. It doesn't mean anything. It only means that you're expressing both habits, and at every given moment you have a choice. You can practice bodhicitta the very next moment right after you've blown it. And you should, because the best way to prevent blowing it again is to climb right back on that horse and make restitution. That's the best way to get right back on it. If you don't do that, you carry a tremendous burden as a spiritual person, the burden of hypocrisy. You feel like a hypocrite. You feel like you've really messed up. You have this idea that you've been kind, and then this monster in you comes out, and then you're faking it again. You can't think like that. You can't think in terms of good or bad, high or low. Think in terms of habitual tendency. Give yourself a break. You have both. Accept it now. Accept it now. And this way, no matter what happens, you're not going to have to think something vile about yourself. And you have the freedom to make a choice at any moment. My recommendation is that should you begin to practice bodhicitta and find it extremely difficult, do not form conclusions about it. Only continue. The only conclusion you should form really is the one that I'm giving you. That's my habit. I understand that about myself. I accept it. And I accept that I can change it little by little, and that it's hard. It's all right if it's hard, one day at a time, you know? So, little by little, you begin to change your habit. If you really blow it, and you will, accept that right now too. You will. You're bound to blow it. When you blow it, you can prepare yourself by that by saying, as a sentient being, I will probably blow it again, and when I do, I'm going to get right back on the horse, and I'm going to make restitution, and I'm not going to form any conclusions about myself. I'm going to let my mind relax. And get right back on the horse by practicing bodhicitta in the very next moment, plus confess in your mind that you were wrong just there. Confession in your mind is very, very important. Boy, I really blew it just then. Boy, I was really wrong just then. and make restitution as quickly as you can. Sometimes we have a kind of pride that says you're going to look like a jerk if you say, whoa, to somebody that you were just mean to. Say, whoa, you know, I've really been trying to practice generosity, and I realize I was not generous to you, not at all. I realize that that was pretty sleazy, what I just did, and so I'd like to ask you if there's anything I could do for you. Now, most of us have too much pride to do that, but it's the very right thing to do. And you'll feel like a new person once you begin to do that. And that will be not only a pebble in this pile, but that kind of thing, the confessing and making restitution of an already established non-virtuous habit, is like a boulder going into that pile. It's more important than little kindnesses. That kind of acceptance and inner peace and moving forward, regardless, really, really helps. It's like a boulder going into that pile. So much more quickly will you get into the habit of kindness. So I heartily recommend that method. The traditional, fundamental ideas of all sentient beings being equal. The realization that all sentient beings are suffering equally. That it is unacceptable to see their suffering. That all sentient beings are interrelated with us. These fundamental thoughts are really important. But go on from that and practice the mechanics of changing habitual tendency. It's not enough to be theoretical. The biggest fault that I find in Buddhist practitioners is that they keep it academic. I do not myself like academic Buddhist students. I would rather you knew nothing about the academics of practice and a heck of a lot about changing the habitual tendency of self-absorption through a real practice. Because academics is not going to get you anywhere but between your ears. On the other hand, giving rise to the bodhicitta and pure view and changing habitual tendencies will lead to profound realization, to the perfect awakening. Not only that, but it will lead to a better world. So for my money, I feel like the best thing that you can do is to begin to practice in a small and simple way. You don't have to be a Buddhist to do that either. And you don't have to be a highfalutin practitioner to do that either. You don't have to wear the robes, or walk the walk, or dance the dance, or talk the talk, or even have a nifty mala, which seems to be the highest priority when we first become a Buddhist. Big deal. The highest priority should be loving kindness and should begin in whatever small way that you can, making no conclusions other than the fact that you have a pattern and that you can change it. Remember the idea of the scales. That's really important. Remember the idea of applying the method today, now. Remember the idea of confession and restitution immediately after any breakage. How potent. What an incredibly potent way to live. Can you imagine living without the burden of guilt or the burden of the false assumption that you're a bad person? You'd have so much spare time on your hands. You wouldn't know what to do. Because all the things you do to prove yourself, you wouldn't have to do anymore. Isn't that true? Do yourself a favor. Live simply in that way. It's the best and highest practice. In Vajrayana tradition, we're given many things that we can do. We practice ngundro, preliminary practice. We meditate on the thoughts that turn the mind. We practice generational stage practice, completion stage practice. We visualize ourselves as the meditational deity and pronounce mantra. All of those things are meant to put more in this pile. Because while you're doing things in this pile, you're not doing things in the other pile. Virtuous as opposed to non-virtuous. And eventually the tables are turned, or the scales are turned. You can begin with the most important practice, that of loving kindness, that of viewing others as equal. Don't view them as worse than you, no matter what they look like, and that way there won't be anybody better than you. all of which has been taught by the Buddha and is absolutely true. When we respect the lamas and put them on thrones and things like that, it isn't because they're better people. It's because they've accomplished their practice. Their minds have become purified through really practicing virtuous activity. They've given rise to the bodhicitta. They've given rise to the perfect awakening. They've given rise to the mind of enlightenment. What we worship, what we enthrone, is the presence of the mind of enlightenment in the world. But you should also be doing that within your own heart. The way that you would enthrone the mind of enlightenment within your heart, the way that you would worship the mind of enlightenment's appearance in the world, is to practice as I've just said. Make that your heart practice. Enthrone that. And do not fall prey to the condition of samsara having any impact on you at all. Remain pure. Not by holding yourself in some artificial way. I hate that, frankly. This idea about saints having their eyes turned ever skyward and acting like martyrs is like stinko. It's a big ego trip. Big ego trip. The reality is moment by moment. And I've just given you a very simple way to do it. So you have no excuse. You're free to start now. And don't start by drawing conclusions as to how good or bad you are. Draw one conclusion, that is, we all have habits. And these habitual tendencies can be changed by forming new habits. Period. So I'll leave you with that thought, and I really hope that whether you're actually practicing as a Buddhist or not, that you can take that home and use it, because that is a working philosophy that can become part of your life and should become part of your life. As a Buddhist, of course, it's the ultimate ordination. The ultimate ordination. As an ordinary sentient being, I hope that you feel a lot freer than you did before. Free to change. Free to be what you can be. Nanda.